Final Fantasy XIV Hot Takes off the presses, ready for your auditory consumption. Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and we have some hot takes this week for Final Fantasy XIV that require quite a bit of discussion. Some really interesting topics, so buckle up, strap yourselves in, because we're going to have to talk about egads! No, it can't be anything but nuance! Let's just rip it. The first take for today is a take I was considering for quite a while to just make a video all on its own, but I think we can make it work here. So let's do it. We have at Thomas Cranor 2668 who says, hot take. Final Fantasy XIV is losing popularity because they've stopped staying on theme. It's changed from the theme's artistic and narrative that drew in the original crowd. So now it's kind of like Lord of the Rings with Fortnite characters instead of original Tolkien characters. There's parts of this that I agree with and other parts that I don't agree with, and I want to talk about this because when it comes to overall artistic styling and the themes that Final Fantasy XIV has covered, and not just in terms of overall narrative, but in terms of visual aesthetic as well, I've liked the vast majority of what they've done. However, I will say that I tend to prefer two expansions in terms of overall aesthetic more so than the others, those being Heavensward and Shadowbringers, with a couple of zones from Endwalker that I really liked, namely Ultima Thule, Elpis, and Garlemald somewhat. Final Fantasy XIV has always been a game that has had a wide range of aesthetics within it, even back in the days of, say, 1.0 and A Realm Reborn. The contrast between the more fantastical Eorzea with the more mechanically advanced Magitech utilizing Garlemald Empire being a great dichotomy here, which is also an aesthetic that is inherent to Final Fantasy and has been for a long time. One of my favorite expansions in terms of overall aesthetics is Heavensward. God and all the different zones just having this certain bite to it that has always appealed to me. I've always loved high fantasy as a concept, and I think Heavensward in particular does a great job of implementing that into the game, but also have this beautiful emotional undertone going through it. I think the soundtrack to Heavensward really helps alongside that, with like the Heavensward theme and also Dragon Song being just some of my favorite pieces of music in this game. And I don't want this next part to come off as me saying, or people interpreting it as me saying that I'm not enjoying the modern game, or even the modern story. There's large elements to it that I disagree with and I'm not that big of a fan of, but I still quite like things like Solution 9, the Alexandria stuff like that. I would still say I'm a fan of those elements. However, there's an emotional undercurrent of, say, I'm finding it hard to find the exact words. I think despair's the closest I can come up with right now. Or this feeling of being hopeful in a world filled with hopelessness that I got out of expansions like Heavensward and Shadowbringers and parts of Endwalker as well. I love things like the Final Days. I love when Final Fantasy XIV and its story get pretty dang dark, because I think where Final Fantasy XIV in particular has historically shined for me is when we're able to find hope in that dark, that light in the proverbial dark. Feeling this giant menace of Nidhogg on the steps of faith, staring that jabroni down, as Dragon Song plays in the background and he stands on his brother's like broken body right before that trial fight. That is a key moment in Final Fantasy XIV for me, one that I've always remembered and will never forget. It's one of my favorite pieces of imagery in Final Fantasy XIV that encapsulates a lot of the aesthetic brilliance that I loved out of Heavensward. It's a great distillation of a lot of things that I love out of the game, and I felt that a couple of times later on as well. I am more receptive to Stormblood than a lot of people, in my opinion. Personally, I didn't mind Elise and all that, but listen to the song Revolutions from Stormblood. Like, that is the feel that I liked out of Stormblood. Going on the offensive against the Garlemald Empire. I loved characters like Xenos, even back in Stormblood. Actually came to love him throughout the events of 4.0. And while there were elements thematically that I'm like, here or there on, for the most part, Rising from the Ashes and that overall theme in Stormblood, I was quite receptive to. Shadowbringers is just immaculate for the most part, in my opinion. Few pacing issues here and there, like the train section, and a few smaller pieces throughout, but on the whole, I think Shadowbringers does a great job of feeling that high fantasy feel that I think Final Fantasy XIV was starting to lose at that point in time. Shadowbringers largely managed to recapture. When it comes to Endwalker, I'm not big on places like Ratahan, or even, I forget the name, the zone underneath Sharlayan. They They look cool, they're just places like Elpis or Ultima Thule are more up to my speed. I also tend to love snowy locations, so Golemold should appeal to me. However, just in terms of overall zone design, it was largely, at least to me, felt like a giant square with half of it being a ruined city. Still really cool, and I love the story that happened there, because again, dark and emotional, but you felt that, like, thread of hope through all that darkness. It's an element of Final Fantasy XIV, and I think when it's able to capture that feel, Final Fantasy XIV is at its best, and I haven't really gotten that out of Dawntrail, because Dawntrail's going for something different for the most part. It tried to capture that feeling again, I just didn't feel it with stuff like the Invasion arc, though I thought that part was kind of cool. It's a tough conversation because Final Fantasy XIV has kind of built itself up over the years to have a bunch of varying aesthetics. And I don't think it's like, oh, all the aesthetics of this expansion are completely different to this expansion. Or maybe the more apt way to put it is that, oh, the game has completely changed its feel going from this expansion to this expansion. Some of it is intentional, but it still has moments that I'm like, this is really cool. It's just any qualms I have here are because of like other factors like writing and pacing and stuff like that. But I think on the whole, Dawntrail appeals to me less aesthetically than previous expansions. And it kind of feels as if Final Fantasy XIV is losing some, not all, some of that overt high fantasy feel that I used to get. I'm not saying that it is, I'm just saying from my perspective, that's how it feels to me. In terms of overall tone and atmosphere, I'm not getting what I loved out of expansions like Heavensward, even parts of A Realm Reborn, and also Shadowbringers. It feels more in line with, say, Stormblood. And there's a lot of people out there that love that idea, that love that overall aesthetic and that overall look and feel. When done well, I like it too, just not to the same degree as, say, the more high fantasy elements like Heavensward and Shadowbringers, even when you mix in the sci-fi elements, because that's another area that I do love out of Final Fantasy XIV. It's one of the main reasons I love places like Solution 9, though the glamour itself doesn't particularly appeal to me for the most part. And I will also say I am just not a fan of Hrothgar, and the game has really leaned into having a lot of Hrothgar characters, or like non-humanoid characters, and they just tend not to be my favorite. That's not like a major problem for me when it comes to Dawntrail. I think Dawntrail has had other way bigger issues in terms of overall writing and dialogue than just a lot of the characters are lizard people or cat people, and not the Makote kind. But it's another example of Final Fantasy XIV's aesthetic moving away from what I personally prefer. Doesn't make it bad or anything, it's just pivoting in a different direction. As I was editing this video, I decided that I wanted to go get some actual footage from Heavensward, and as I was watching a lot of those cutscenes again, a thought occurred to me why I think I prefer the vibe from back then to a lot of the vibe we see now in the modern game in Final Fantasy XIV. These big climactic moments, like that standoff against Nidhogg at the Steps of Faith, moments like that, and a lot of the time in older versions of the MSQ, when you get this big climactic moment, it feels, from both the music, the cinematography, the emotion dripping in the voice acting, it feels like we're clawing victory from the jaws of defeat and we're overcoming insurmountable odds. And the extremely emotional music, like Dragon Song, for that moment on the Steps of Faith just drive it all home for me. And it's a feeling that I haven't gotten out of the modern game, for the most part, outside of a few key moments in time. Personally, I quite liked how Ultima Thule panned out in this regard. But when it comes to, say, the tone of Dawntrail, and the tone that some of the direction Final Fantasy XIV has gone in, these big climactic emotional moments where you feel like, oh my god, I can't believe we just did that, they're kind of replaced for moments where we go, alright, and now we're gonna win. Play the blood-pumping music, it's time to go all out. We suffered long enough, now it's time to fight back. Hell yeah, dude! It's like that point in a superhero story where you know, okay, heroes about to win here. That has a place, don't get me wrong, but I do really miss just that emotional feel that moments like this used to have for the most part. I think Heavensward was a great example of it happening a lot, and I think now, as I talk about in the rest of this video, when you overplay the hand, where we know we're safe, we know we're gonna come out on top, you lose lose the ability to feel like that. And to me, I do think it's a detriment. Now, this kind of segues into our next conversation that I want to have today. And with the next take from @CocoBlack, they say, but for real, Thancred should have died in Shadowbringers after the fight with Ranjit. Also in Ultima Thule, heroic sacrifices don't hit at all when you know there are literally no stakes. This ties to me back into that overall feeling of emotion that I was talking about with Final Fantasy XIV historically. Because I think this is another one of the elements of Final Fantasy XIV that has eroded away over the years. And it's not that Final Fantasy XIV is behaving any differently than it was back in, say, Stormblood, but it is behaving differently to before that. Well, actually, no, now that I think about it, the Sultana as well. Alright, let's get into the actual meat and potatoes of what I'm talking about here. I think for a lot of us, when we first played Final Fantasy XIV and its overall story, and we went from A Realm Reborn to Heavensward to Stormblood, it felt really gritty and it felt really emotional, and it felt like every moment in time there were a bunch of stakes, because we believed subconsciously that any of these characters, outside of maybe a couple, were on the chopping block potentially and could suffer massive complications or even just end up dying. When the Sultana first died, it was this big moment where it's like, oh, there are real stakes going on here. Alongside what happened with Moondrita, but we had more of a connection with the Sultana. It was a bigger moment in my opinion. Then when the Sultana came back, a lot of us, myself included, kind of wrote it off as a one-off where it's like, oh, okay, bit of a weird way to end this storyline, but kind of works, sure, I'm cool with it. I don't need every character to die. But it's like, in Heavensward, it clearly felt like they watched Game of Thrones last week because they killed off quite a few characters and they baited us on quite a few other characters potentially dying. But what this managed to do, alongside teasing things like, oh, Y'shtola's going to die at some point because of insert reason here. This also leads into Stormblood and everything that happened there. Actually, that's why I think the Y'shtola stuff took place. It felt as if all of these characters, one had a story to tell, but we didn't know when their story would end. And for me at least, it made me more invested in what was going to come up next, because I'm like, what's going to happen to this character, or this character, or this character? How will they make it out of this situation, or will they even make it out? And then we get Shadowbringers, and Shadowbringers is so dang good, and I've talked about historically on this channel how it's my favorite video game story ever told, and I love it to death. Though for me right now it's like neck and neck with Nier Automata. You do have that moment with Thancred and Ranjit, and I didn't mind that Thancred didn't die there. And in retrospect, I still don't think he had to die there. But what it does show is an example of this character ain't gonna die. Because if you're not going to kill him there, how would you kill him afterwards? And again, when we get to Ultima Thule, I didn't mind that all the characters' quote-unquote deaths were bait-and-switches. I always figured there's no shot they're going to kill all the Scions in one fell swoop at the end of it all. There's no way they would ever do that. I didn't believe it for a second, so when they all came back, it wasn't a surprise to me. However, again, if you manage to live through that, you're good as a character. Because all their stories mostly could have had a bow put on them at that point in time. And like, if you were going to kill off any of these characters, it would have happened then, but you didn't. So at least in my subconscious, and I think this applies for a lot of people out there, at this point, does anyone actually believe a Scion is going to die in the near future? Because I don't. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but again, it removes that element that the story used to have, where I was emotionally invested and waiting with bated breath to find out what happened next, because I didn't know what was going to happen. But now, because you've shown me this proclivity to not allow these characters to die, and for them to find a way to come back and be good at the end of it all, it inherently lowers the stakes for me. A good story can still be written with that perspective and in that light, in my opinion, but it does change the feel of it all. And that goes back to what I was talking about before, where that emotional response Final Fantasy XIV used to be able to instill within me, or drag out of me. And also, if you show a willingness to kill important characters, it makes those moments in time when you actually do manage to save someone. Think back to like Istinian on the Steps of Faith. When you manage to save him, it feels so much more impactful and important, because we knew there was a good chance he could have died there, and that the writers would have possibly pulled that trigger. It elicits a bigger emotional response if we don't know what's going to happen. I still love Final Fantasy XIV XIV, but for different reasons now. And again, this isn't why Dawntrail is subpar for me. That's other reasons. It's just an element that's like, the aesthetic and the overall theme, not necessarily in terms of what the theme of the message of the story is, but in terms of the overall feel of the game, it's moving in a direction that appeals to me less than what came before. And I do agree with Coco's opinion that heroic sacrifices don't hit at all when you know there are literally no stakes. One of my biggest storytelling qualms that I have with a lot of stories is when they have an accelerated use of character death. When I know every character is pretty much going to die, I lose interest in the characters themselves because I know there's no point in getting attached to them or invested because they're just going to be on the chopping block and used to elicit an emotional response from that. For me, and I will be perfectly honest, it is hard to please me in this regard, and it's something I've come to just accept. I am exceedingly picky when it comes to character death and how it's handled. Probably more so than the average person. I'm not saying that I'm right to anything like that, I'm just saying to appeal to me, it is harder. Because if character death is too underutilized, we get this feeling right now, where I still think a good story can be told, same with the inverse, if you kill a lot of characters, a good story can still be told. I quite like Game of Thrones for the longest time. It's just harder, because you don't want to kill characters just for the sake of killing characters, because I think over time, you get a similar feel, at least to me, just in a different way, to where I become less interested because I know all the characters are just going to die, so I don't actively try to become invested with any of the characters. But in the same time, if I know everyone is safe, then I become less interested because I know nothing really bad's ever going to happen here. To that extreme. Now let's pivot over as a extension to a conversation we had last week about implementing gameplay in terms of the actual narrative going on. And now, from time to time, Final Fantasy XIV does a pretty good job of that in my opinion. We have at 1337 Penguin Man, who says, if you remember the In From the Cold scenario in Endwalker, that is how you integrate gameplay and storytelling. Also, here's my hot take, I think Wook was originally written to be an actual child. I've seen some takes in my comment section in regard to that latter point. I can kind of see it, to where a lot of her mannerisms and lack of knowledge make a bit more sense for a childlike character, and Wooklamon doesn't come off, visually at least, as a child. Though I am pretty sure she is still relatively young. I'm kind of here or there on it. I don't think it makes or breaks the story. Like I said before, and we've talked about before on this channel, my issues with Dawntrail are deeper than that, but I want to talk about integrating gameplay and storytelling. And the moment that really resonated with me back in Endwalker was that moment where we were separated from our body and we were forced to hijack like this grunt soldier and make our way back to camp because Xenos was going in to kill somebody, using our form to do it. That sense of tension is something unique, in my opinion, that you're able to elicit out of the player and the consumer as a video game when you integrate gameplay and story together and you don't have them be separate things with like, okay, we need you to play the game now here's your reward, here's an actual story going on. When you're able to intertwine storytelling with gameplay and have the story be told through the gameplay, that is something that is unique to the video game medium. And it can be a strong emotional response, at least for me, that I don't get out of other mediums. It's one of the reasons I love video games so much. And while I don't think that scenario was the most well executed in all of Final Fantasy XIV, and just overall, for instance, I think the actual mechanical things you were doing there were rather tedious and a bit dull. And I don't think it helped that the rotation you had while piloting that soldier was like exceedingly dull, in my opinion. I think they got a bit better when it comes to controlling other characters in Dawntrail. I think it's actually, funnily enough, one of Dawntrail's strengths. But what I've talked about last week, and I'm going to reiterate here, is that I am not of the opinion that just because an idea or a system may not be executed the best with its initial integration into the game, I don't think that's justification for removing it wholesale. I don't think that's a good enough of a justification to never try that idea again, because I think the root concept there is something Final Fantasy XIV should and shun, just because some people had a difficult time with it. It's something I believe you should do more of to train the player base to be able to better overcome those kinds of trials, because it leads to more interesting ways to tell the story in Final Fantasy XIV by integrating gameplay with story, and also gives Square Enix another opportunity to try and make it more fun and interesting than the scenarios that we had back in Endwalker. And they largely moved away from them when it comes to Dawntrail, outside of the big 1v1 fights, which I think was another one of the highlights for Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. But I don't think it's healthy moving forward for Final Fantasy XIV's story to largely just be a bunch of cutscenes back to back to back. Dawntrail tried to have quite a few gameplay elements in it, and I appreciated those elements for the most part. I would like to see them be a bit more involved, not to like an outrageous degree or anything, but I want the gameplay while I'm playing the story to be really fun, and that not to just be out of the dungeons or the trials. I want to have more like, oh crap, this is serious moments, like I had when we first played through that soldier section in Golemold and Endwalker. And sure, in retrospect, it kind of goes back to that previous point where since nothing really happened to anyone, it kind of removes a bit of that emotional gravity that it had when you first played through it. But again, just because of its execution initially doesn't mean that I think it always has to be like that. I think a system like that has a ton of potential. You don't want to just repeat it by itself, but say, how can we tell this part of the story in an interesting way through gameplay? And I think if Final Fantasy XIV continues to lean in that direction, I think I'll be better off. So with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts, your opinions, your own hot takes about Final Fantasy XIV, and I may react to them in a future video. Stay safe, have a great day. I'll see you all next time. Bye bye, everybody. Until we meet again.